it is awful bright up here. And those ladies were very funny. It was excellent. I don't know if my stories is funny, but I always wanted a big family when I grew up. But I was the only child with a single mother. But I watched the Brady Bunch, loved The Sound of Music. I always seemed to have friends with huge families. My best friend in elementary school was the youngest of 7. 3 boys, 3 girls. That was 3 girls and then 3 boys and then her. She was spoiled rotten and nobody paid any attention to what we did. That was great. But my mother did not feel the same way. I'm pretty sure she thought that our small family of 2 was absolutely perfect. And she had tried her hand at marriage. But by the time I was 8, she had gotten her 3rd divorce. She was done with that. It was just the 2 of us. It pretty much had really always been the 2 of us, but it was official. So despite my wanting a really big family, it was not to be. And I was not foolish. I understood where families came from. And I was never really quite sure why we didn't have an extended family. But I also instinctively knew that my mother didn't want to talk about it. And I was very close to my mother. I was a good daughter. And so we didn't talk about it. I just never brought it up. Until my 20s, I got a little curious. I started going to my own doctor's appointments. They started asking about, things like my family medical history. And I realized that I only had one data point, which was my mother. As any good scientist knows, you need more than one data point. So I hatched a plan to ask her, and I tagged along with her on a vacation that we were going on, and I found a particularly good day. We had been shopping, we had played bingo, her favorite thing, swum in the pool, and so in the hotel room, I said, decided to pop the question. And I said, so why is it that we don't have any family, and we don't ever talk about that? And she said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, like, well, what do you want to know? And I said, everything. And so she spent the next few hours just going on and on about the family tree and the stories and so many pieces of information that apparently I could have had if I had asked, but now I was asking. And what was most interesting to me was her childhood. I really only knew, of course, from the time that I came into her life. And one of her earliest memories was that she grew up with her grandparents, and that every Sunday they would go to what her grandmother said was a 4-H camp to go visit her mother. And it was a large cement cinder block room with lots of other mothers who were being visited by their families. And my mother pieced together later in life that her mother had been in prison during this time. And in fact, she had, her and her girlfriend and their boyfriends had a little cat burglary ring called the Double Date Gang. And they got caught and they got put in jail. So hence my mother living with her grandparents. And when her mother got out of jail, she moved in with her mother, and her mother remarried, and they had another baby. And as often happens, the baby got a lot of the attention. My mother felt somewhat neglected, except in certain ways. Her mother and her stepfather drank a lot, and they fought, and she was definitely the victim of a belt whipping more than once. And unfortunately, as my mother matured and came of age, my stepfather took other interests, her stepfather took other interests in her and began to be interested in fondling her in inappropriate ways. And he would sometimes barter with her, essentially, and say, well, I will take your mother out tonight in exchange for these favors. And having them both home, drinking and fighting, was actually so despicable that she would acquiesce. But clearly she wasn't happy about it. So she hatched a plan. She decided that she would look up her birth father. She had never known him. He apparently lost the custody battle. And all she knew was that his name was Jack Parr. And this is New Jersey, early 70s. As you can imagine, there were a lot of Jack Parrs in the phone book. So she started working her way through the list, and she finally reached Jack Parr Sr., who was her grandfather. And he put her in touch with her father. And she somehow convinced him to come out and rescue her, take her away from the situation. She was 16. And she really just traded one hell for another. Her father had not been used to being a father, and he was rather domineering, and she was miserable, but in different ways. But she finished high school, she went off to college, and she very quickly got pregnant and picked one of her suitors, the one who was the most scared of her father and would assure that they would leave, and got married and started off in her life. And my mother and I actually never repeated any part of that conversation later. It was clearly a one-night pass that she wanted to answer my questions, and it was clearly still something she didn't really care to talk about a lot. But I'm so glad that I asked her, because it was only 5 years later that she passed away from an aggressive form of cancer at a very, very young age of 50. And for a very long time, life went on. I mean, not normally, obviously painfully, but I went on. I felt a wonderful person. I married into a wonderful family, but I, felt this hole. And it took me a very long time to realize that I really was just holding on to my mother's story. I was essentially holding on to her grudge against her mother for not keeping her safe. And after 7 years, I realized that I actually have family out there. Like, that there's nothing to keep me from looking these people up. I'm not going to offend my mother. I should just go for it. And so I did some research on the internet, and I found my grandmother. She was my mother's mother, that I was most interested in getting in touch with. And I was encouraged by the fact that I also found a divorce record, that she had divorced the stepfather in '93. And I said, oh good, I don't want to see him. And so yeah, I called her up, 39 years old. Hi, I'm your granddaughter. And I came down to visit her in North Carolina. We had a very wonderful and emotional reunion. And I got to, I walk in the door first thing, of course, and first of all, my mother's 5'8", I'm 5'2". I walk in the door, there is my grandmother. She is short like me, much more petite, but short. She's got my freckles, and the first thing she does is serve me lunch on leopard print plates. And I'm like, okay, this is gonna be okay. And over the course of the afternoon, I finally find a time to break into this more private discussion about how my mother left. I realize that it's not dinner table conversation, so I find my time. And what I learned from my grandmother is very beautiful. I learned how scared and hurting she was during that time. And I learned that even if my mother had wanted to come back, that her stepfather had said the next day that she was never to enter this house again, and then my grandmother was never to say her name again. And my grandmother kept that promise for over 40 years. And I also learned that my grandmother was relieved, in a sense. As guilty as she felt, she was relieved that my mother had found a way to safety, that she had found her way out. And I also learned that my grandmother had many more years and many more painful episodes before she found her own way out, which she finally did. And the irony, of course, when I went to see her, is that I found out that she was living with him again, the stepfather. I had always wanted a family. I didn't know it was going to be so crazy and messy, but it is. It's beautiful. She was living with him again because he had bought a house next door to their son and grandson, so my uncle and my cousin. And he offered for her to live there rent-free. Maybe out of kindness, maybe out of guilt, maybe a little bit of both. And she said, well, if you're going to see my grandson every day, I'm going to see my grandson every day. And so she lives there in a separate room, separate half of the house, out of spite, stubbornness. Some things run in families. And we kept in touch the past few years over phone and letters. My grandmother's not on a computer, so no email, but letters and phone. And this summer I was able to go down for a second visit. And this is where it gets kind of fun because although I never had a big family growing up, I realized that the first time you meet your grandmother is not when you ask about their time in prison. Nor is it really a phone conversation. But the second time, I was not going to let any time go. Time is really short. My grandmother and I have been very big about, no secrets, way too long. We came to each other as adults. I came to her not expecting anything, and therefore we've also been just very open with each other about our lifestyles and our choices, and there's been enough secrets. So this time when I got to go, I got to actually meet more cousins. I have so many cousins now. I had to look up after my visit, like what to call them. I apparently have a lot of first cousins once removed. Those are the ones I met. I'm sure I have a bunch more, but I had to keep looking up, what do I call you on my phone? And anyway, but I got to ask her about her time behind bars. I got to learn about this wonderful time that she escaped prison, was on the lam for about a year. She convinced a juvenile court judge, a female juvenile court judge in the late 50s, happened to be the one to pick her up in her prison stripy dress. And my grandmother managed to convince her that she was escaped from the juvenile detention center and that she was scared of all the big black lesbians. And so this woman gave her a dress, drove her all the way to her house, and bought her a bus ticket to Memphis to reunite with her mother. That's where her boyfriend lived. And the best story that I got from her too was that when she first ended up in prison, she actually got put on kitchen duty. And as you've seen in all the movies, you have to dole out one of everything. And of course, this big woman comes by and is like, new girl, give me two. And my grandmother's like, no. She said something mean to my grandmother, and my grandmother said something nasty back. Let's run in the family. No, I'm very proud of her. Anyway, so the woman dives over the line at my grandmother, who's very petite, fails to account for the fact that my grandmother has a meat fork in her hand, which she stabs her in the neck with. She's okay. She's okay. These are the kind of stories you can get in person. You don't ask this over the phone. Anyway, I really don't know how my mother would feel about this. I don't know if she would agree. Essentially, the biggest disagreement that my mother and I have had has occurred after her life, because this is the one thing that she kept silent on her whole life until I asked. And if I've learned anything in this life, though, it's that you have to make your own decisions. You can't let other people decide what's right for you. My mother made her decision when she chose to run away because her parents didn't understand her. One parent didn't understand what was appropriate touching, and the other parent didn't understand how to keep her safe. And I know today that I am a strong, independent woman because of that decision that my mother made, and because she also instilled in me to make my own decisions early in life. So, while I'll never know if my mother agreed with my decision, I feel certain that she would respect it.